Welcome everyone to this session on cancel culture featuring Loretta and Tran. My name is Talitha Maitland. I'm one of the tri-chairs of this conference and the STEM librarian at Cal State San Marcos. I'm a biracial Vietnamese American cis woman. I have medium length dark hair. My pronouns are she, her. And thank you so much for everyone for being here. As part of our CFA practices, we're going to start off today with the land acknowledgement, a grounding in, and with our interruption practice statement. And then we will move on to a couple of logistics and then to the presentation itself. We want to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the traditional land of the indigenous people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land, and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important Indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today. Okay, and then next, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Loretta and Tran, who will be speaking to us about cancel culture in academia. Loretta is a professor at Smith College in the program for the study of women and gender, where she teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling out culture. She's joined by Tran, a leader in the liberation struggles for migrants, LGBTQ people, communities of color, and youth and students. Okay, Loretta and Lone, the Zoom is yours.
I am honored to be here. I am an African-American elder woman with dreadlocks. I've been dreading since 1980, dark-skinned, and I have an African print dress on.
I am a younger Vietnamese person, gender non-conforming, with long black hair, and I'm currently wearing a black shirt today. And it's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Well, we're going to talk to y'all about calling in the calling out culture. This is a framework that Lone and I have been working on for the past several years. Calling in is actually a phrase that Lone created in 2013. As a young, I believe, 18-year-old activist coming from a conference, I think it was a Facing Race conference, and you can tell that story, and being a bit perturbed about how busy people were criticizing each other's social justice practices. And I came to the movement in 2015 when I started noticing how brutal people were to each other on social media. And so for the past couple of years, I've been training, along with Lone, who joined me last year, people on how to build practices for challenging the call out culture. Because I think that there's an inevitable victory about our struggle for human rights and justice, but my greatest fear is that we might self-destruct on the way to that victory if we don't learn how to be kinder, gentler, and more politically useful to each other. So Lone, you want to start the share?
Yes, thanks, Loretta. All right, so as Loretta shared, today we are going to be talking about calling in the calling out culture. And again, we're really grateful to join all of you at your annual equity conference From Here to There, Building the Social Justice Bridge. And that is on theme for our conversation today. So we're really excited to get started. First, we want to share two quotes from Bayard Rustin, a civil rights leader. He says, first, we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. And I've always really loved that phrase because we are raising trouble in some of the most angelic ways possible for some of the most angelic causes. And at the same time, he says, let us be enraged about injustice, but let us not be destroyed by it. So there are some themes in this conversation that we'll touch on both in these slides and through our conversations and through our Q&A about what it means to tap into our anger and to direct that anger in a way that is generative, that is productive, because we need that as a source of power for the work that we're engaged in, but we can't let it destroy who we are and how we relate to each other. So we're excited to explore that with each of you. We first want to start by setting just the framework for what calling in is, as we'll be spending some time talking about why callouts happen and specifically why and how they happen in the academic setting. But we want to share this at the front end so that folks can consider what it takes and what it means to build a calling in culture. At its essence, calling in is a call out that's done with radical love to achieve accountability. It's this recognition that, especially for those of us who are coming to human rights work and social justice movements, we are human beings who are complex, who are complicated, who hold our own pains that we may or may not always share with others. So as such, calling in is not an identity-based practice. It's actually an opportunity for everyone to self-reflect, to learn how to apologize more effectively, to be able to repair from harm and mistakes, and of course, to be able to change our behaviors once we've been able to learn the impact that it's had. Calling in encourages us to remember what the bigger picture is. So we spend a lot of time, especially in social justice movements, critiquing and analyzing and making sense of why the situation in front of us is so terrible or so challenging. But we also have to be able to keep in mind what it is we actually want. Because it takes both the critique and the vision we have for the world to complete this picture. And so calling in really encourages us to stay attuned to that. It encourages the spirit of inquiry and curiosity. We're asking more questions of each other. We're asking in the spirit of learning and growing. And we're also using our active and loving listening practices to really seek to understand one another and not just collecting information on one another so that we can one-up each other, so that we can compete, so that we can prove who's better than who or who's more correct. Again, it's an opportunity to express gratitude for a learning opportunity, to recognize, yeah, we actually don't know everything. And it's awesome when someone else can point that out in a way that's kind and compassionate, and when we're able to do that for others. And last but not least, we want to emphasize that calling in is something that we do for ourselves. It's something that you do for yourself and not necessarily something that you do for someone else. We can't control other people's reactions to us. We can't control how other people move through the world, but we can set a standard for how we function, how we engage, how we act from our own sense of integrity and dignity. So we want to start there because we're going to have to talk about some really difficult things as well. And we want folks to be able to keep in mind this sort of in service of what we're trying to address here. So now I'm going to turn it over to Loretta to talk a little bit about how calling in actually fits into a broader continuum.
Yes, I think we're all pretty familiar with calling out, and we'll be talking more about that. But basically, it's publicly shaming people for something that we think that they've done wrong, for which we think they should be held accountable. And obviously, the ultimate calling out is canceling somebody. So not only do you want to publicly shame them, but you want them to suffer some serious consequence for something you think they've done wrong, whether it's getting fired or getting deplatformed, or at least take a serious hit to their reputation. Along that continuum, of course, is calling in, as Long just described. It's a way of pursuing accountability, but instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming to achieve accountability, you're choosing the tactic of extending people respect, extending people grace, and using your active listening practices to really focus on their humanity and demonstrating your own. Now, the fourth part of the continuum, calling on, was created by Sonia Renee Taylor, an ally of mine who wrote this wonderful book, The Body is Not an Apology. Now, if you call people in or you call people out, you're investing in them your time and attention. But Sonia points out that there may be times you don't want to give people your time and attention, and you want to actually demand that they do better without that investment on your part. So that's when you call on people to do better, to check themselves, to review how they are walking in the world, how they're portraying themselves, how they're misaligned between their inner good opinion of themselves with how they're behaving externally. And the fifth part of the continuum, calling it off, is something I don't think we do enough of, because we have no obligation to continue a non-productive conversation with someone. We're not obligated to extend ourselves either online or in person to someone who's not operating in good faith, if somebody's not willing to listen, but now with someone who's not willing to offer us basic respect. So we have the option of calling it off. We can call it off temporarily by saying something like, I don't have the bandwidth to talk to you right now, or you can call it off permanently. I will never want to discuss this with you again. But I think we should always remember that we have many more options than we've allowed ourselves to consider when we're only using the default tactic of calling people out. These are further explanations of those same things that I talked about, where when you have definitions that say when calling out is publicly demanding that people change their behaviors, canceling when you wanted them to be punished, when you want to call them in, you want to extend grace to them, where you develop the public and private skills for having these difficult dialogues with people, but you're going to do so while respecting their human rights and differences, calling on again, requesting people to do better, but you're not going to make an investment in their growth because you may want to just see how they're going to respond to the fact that you're offering them attention and a chance to reconsider what they've done or said. And of course, calling it off, we all have the power to disengage.
Thank you, Loretta. We'll talk a little bit now, focusing back in on the framework and practice of calling in. And we want to share this roadmap as a helpful tool. Now, roadmaps are not meant to imply that this is the exact way that you approach any conflict or difficult conversation every time, but it gives us a sense of what are my usual choices when I'm traveling down this road and I want to figure out how to engage in a different way than what I've been conditioned to practice within a call out culture. It's important to start with this question that we ask ourselves: how am I doing? How am I responding? Am I really angry right now? Am I hangry, actually? Have I not eaten enough today? Haven't drinking enough water? Am I feeling confused? Am I feeling startled? What's my emotional, physical, mental state? That's really going to shape how I make choices down this road of calling in. I also want to consider, who am I talking to? How is that person showing up? Do they seem tired, more tired than usual? Do they seem really irritated? Do they seem shut down? And what else do I know about who they are, what they value, what they focus on, how they spend their time? What's the quality of our relationship to each other? Do we interact a lot? Do we rarely ever talk? Do I only follow them on Facebook and sort of lurk on their lives? Who exactly am I talking to? And once I have some of that information, I can think about the kinds of outcomes that I'm hoping for. What's going to be different at the end of this conversation if I choose to engage in calling in practices? What's going to change? And these outcomes can really vary. These outcomes can be as simple as, I want to make sure that this particular mistake is never repeated again. I want an apology. I want a commitment to change behavior. I want a follow-up for a second conversation where we can both learn more. It's really important to envision on the front end of what's going to change so we can set ourselves up ideally for the most successful conversation as possible. I also want to consider what's the best intervention. And by intervention, we just mean, how do I communicate the outcomes that I'm envisioning? How do I address the conflict or the disagreement or the mistake or the harm? Does this person respond the best to phone calls? Do they need an email so they have some space to react? Do I need to actually talk to them in person? Do we need to go for a walk or meet up? And of course, usually the question around intervention and outcomes also helps us to think about if there's a better messenger. Am I actually not the person because I'm not doing well, because I'm really exhausted, because I don't work with this person regularly enough, because I don't have the most information? Is there someone else who can deliver this message and it's actually going to be received? Sometimes we can be impacted by a mistake or a harm or a conflict, and we're really not the best person to bring it up or try to come up with a solution or try to reconcile it because it's too tender or it's too raw, or we just simply don't want to. And of course, there is always this question that is perhaps not a question that you need to dive into every time you're practicing calling in or every time there's a conflict, but it is an essential question for how we live our lives and how we engage in human rights work. Can I forgive myself for the mistakes that I've made? And my answer to that is really going to shape whether or not I can forgive other people for the mistakes that they make. And the more I can be self-aware of how that answer shows up in my interactions with others, the better prepared I can be to recognize when I am projecting my own self-judgment, even my own self-hatred, my own sense of imposter syndrome or inadequacies onto someone else. Where am I interpreting my expectations through a lens of how I actually see myself? So again, this is just a general roadmap, and you might, when you're traveling down the road, you might think that you're making the next exit, but you actually don't need to take that exit. You're going to go a little further, or you have to turn around, you have to make a U-turn. So this is not in any way to imply that the journey is linear. You might have to ask yourself multiple times, how am I doing? You might have to ask multiple times, what's the best intervention? And that's okay, because we're trying to build our skill sets that, again, aren't necessarily going to give us a neat and clean script for every interaction we have. So I wanted to share a little bit more about why callouts happen in a general sense, and then Loretta will be speaking more specifically to callouts inside of academia because of her firsthand experience as a professor in those settings. First and foremost, it's important to recognize that we live in a broader culture of punishment and shame. And we see this every day reflected primarily through our policing and prison systems. The idea that people who make mistakes in our society can change by being put into literal cages where they are isolated from their loved ones, isolated from meaningful relationships in their lives, isolated from opportunities to learn and relate and to reorient to what it means to be part of a broader community. It simply doesn't work. It is a crisis that we recognize, and it's a crisis that we recognize as a political objective we need to really address. We recognize that in our campaigns, in our advocacy, but we need to spend a little more time reflecting on how we internalize the messages of these systems into how we relate to each other. If we live in a society where punishment and shame is the letter of the law, is how our courts function, if it's how our justice systems function, then we shouldn't be surprised when we internalize that as the skills and tools and values that we apply to our relationships to each other when harm or mistakes have occurred. We also know that callouts happen because a lot of times we are projecting our past pains onto current situations. And that's just another way of saying each of us are human beings who have a backpack that we're carrying around that's just full of stuff. It's full of pain, it's full of trauma, it's full of uncomfortable and jarring experiences because of our social positions, our identities, or just because sometimes life is hard and things happen. And so then when we come into new situations in our lives, a lot of times those same emotions, those past pains are being activated, or they're being triggered, or they're being brought into the forefront. And we're seeking a way to address that past pain, perhaps by really responding with anger, with defensiveness, with a need to punish other people for the harm that we've experienced in previous parts of our lives. Callouts can also happen, especially within our organizations and any group that's come together to engage in positive social change work, because we actually lack clarity around a shared vision and what our outcomes are. And so when we lack that clarity, it actually leaves some gaps for people's personality and ego to take over. And a big part of why callouts happen is because we've been conditioned to believe that anything we do is competition. Anything we do is about proving how much we know or how correct we are. So if a group that comes together and says we want to address the issue of racial injustice, but we're not clear about how we're going to do that or what it's going to look like, then individual people can just take it up as a personal campaign to prove that they know the most about racial justice, that they have all of the answers. And that creates an environment where it's more likely for people to really treat each other badly as the result of disagreements or conflicts. And so then in that context, we recognize that the challenges we are faced with can sometimes make us feel hopeless or demoralized and powerless. And so then we take it out on each other. And so then it becomes a question of proximity and access, because I can't see or touch or be in the same room as some of my political targets, for example, and I feel so frustrated by that. I feel so angry or sad that we've been fighting the same fight for years, but I can see and touch and meet with and call my coworker and my colleague or my student or my department chair. And so then that person becomes a convenient target for all of these other feelings that we're feeling that we can't direct where we need to direct. Sometimes we just lack concrete skills for addressing disagreements and conflict and harm in a constructive manner. So then callouts become, again, this rat race to prove who is more correct or who knows more or who's better at doing social justice work, and not actually about figuring out what are we actually disagreeing about? What are we fighting about? Who's actually been harmed versus who's actually just been made uncomfortable? We don't have the skills to deal with that. And related to this piece of harm, because we live in the world that we live in, where oftentimes, even in extreme cases of violence, there is no serious response to it from the institutions that are supposedly, meant to respond to those incidences. We're conditioned into overstating harm, that everything is violent, that everything is abuse, that disagreements between people become these massive, painful incidences that often rely too on this framework that we talk about in our curriculum around identity reductionism. So we may have heard of identity politics, and both the right and the left and everyone in between has a perspective on what that means. But when we say identity reductionism, we mean we are more likely to not speak up because the people who are involved in a particular conflict are part of a marginalized community. We may feel that we must defer to people because of their identity, even if their political positions are incorrect. And we're doing that because we feel like that's the thing to do, that proves our allegiance to the cause. But really, it hinders our ability to actually address power imbalances. And that's what ultimately we're trying to do and to transform. We mentioned this earlier, but one of our challenges as social justice movements is that we spend way more time investing in a politic of critique and not a politic of construction. So we can say all of the things that are terrible about an institution, about a situation, about people, and we don't spend enough time to say, well, what could be different and what do we want to see differently and how do we get there, even with all of our disagreements, all of our neuroses, all of our conflicts. And we feel it's important to address that part of this moment we're in around the proliferation of call-out culture is the role of the internet and social media and digital networks that provides a cover for treating people badly. If I can go online and build any kind of audience that I want to build, even anonymously, I could do that. And I could say whatever I want. I could defame people. I could spread rumors. I could gossip. And really, with the way that these digital networks function, I don't ever have to be accountable or responsible for what I say. And so when that becomes so deeply ingrained in our culture of how we relate to each other, then it would make sense that we think we can shame each other, we can bully each other in order to seek political purity without ever being told, actually, you're just being really mean and unhelpful, right? And so I'll turn it over to Loretta now to speak more specifically to the academic context.
One of the things that I think drives the call out culture within academia is the way that we're trained in our academic disciplines. We're trained to be hypercritical. I've never read a thesis or a dissertation that didn't start off first by saying what everybody else in the field did wrong, and then saying, and this is what I'm going to do to correct it. And so we take these radical analyses to top topics, to subjects, but I don't think we take the radical love practices as seriously that we need as a way to balance the hypercriticism of our academic disciplines. And then we go so far as to teach this hypercriticism to students. And so we encourage young people to look for ways to pick holes in other people's perspectives, arguments, and not necessarily to see the power of having differences of opinion. And so our academic rigor easily becomes personal hazing, particularly, I'm sure some of us have been in arguments or debates with people, and we quickly move from debating the issues to ad hominem attacks, where it becomes personal hazing, where if you're losing a fight or you can't maintain your ground in terms of a debate, then they start personally attacking you. And a friend of mine often points out that how our minor disagreements become so magnified in our academic setting. The way she describes it is that in the academy, we often major in the minor, so that any small disagreement, any small differences of perspective can be magnified into a lot of major attention, time wasting, and in many ways hurt feelings. I think that we also have to pay close attention to the fact that within the academy, our status wars will have financial and professional consequences, whether or not someone is denied tenure, whether someone can be made a department chair, and things like that. And so people fight very fiercely for that status, for, is it an associate professor or my full professor? And then we have these bureaucracies that have their own processes that really reward people for calling each other out and sometimes putting each other down instead of boosting each other up. And then on top of all of this, we can be in institutions that don't necessarily get our backs, that they fail to stand up for faculty, particularly progressive faculty who attract negative press attention. So for example, if you're at an institution that is shying away from dealing with racial injustice or gender injustice or trans injustice, then they may want to throw anybody who tries to stand up against white supremacy, racism, or misogyny under the bus as a way of what they think is preserving the university reputation, particularly universities that are uncertain around their stance on the First Amendment, whether or not they understand that their job is to teach young people the power of critical inquiry, the power of analysis. Their job is not to act like a substitute for the government and try to say, well, we have to protect the First Amendment, because that's actually the role of the government. Our job is to protect the educational environments of our students. But having said that, we also have to realize that we're caught up in a neoliberal project where students are treated as customers, and they're given disproportionate power to affect people's livelihoods from a perspective where necessarily they don't know all they need to know without passing very harsh and hypercritical judgments on professors and staff and administrators based on how we make them feel versus how we offer them an education. One of the things that I'm constantly challenging my students at is that they need to understand that my job is not to protect them from the truth, but teach them how to handle the truth. And that is a different project altogether. And then we have these bureaucracies where it's very difficult to even deal with accountability for the harms that take place in universities, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's discrimination, whether it's a safety issue, largely because these problems are referred to the black hole of human resources and called private, so that nobody actually knows or understands outside of the people handling the problem what is actually going on, who is held accountable. And many of us have our Title IX offices caught up in all of these privacy issues where even when someone reports problems to us, we don't know how to deal with it. And then that creates the situation where people, because they don't have information, they start making up their own narratives about what's going on, and that contributes to the call out culture. And then there's a mismatch sometimes between our lofty mission and vision statements of the values that we say our institutions and universities want to uphold, and then the fact that we have these structures of injustices and privileges that are often well disguised beneath the surface, so that there is a dissonance between what we say we're dedicated to and the fact that we insist on traditional patterns that can be quite oppressive and in fact cause a lot of harm. And when that happens, of course, that contributes to the call out culture. And of course, we are very resistant to rapid change, and that slow pace of change contributes to frustration, anger, and blaming. And so why should we be surprised when so many people say, well, I can't, I've asked for this change. I don't think people are moving fast enough. And so that's going to contribute to the call out culture as well. And so all of these things are what we need to deal with in academia to understand that part of the call out culture that we're experiencing is based on how we're structured, what we do, and what we pay attention to.
Thank you, Loretta. You just named a lot there, both in terms of the internal dynamics that are unique to how academia is set up, and some of the larger political and social and cultural contexts around the attacks on education in general, as ideally a public institution and public arena where anyone who seeks to can learn about history, learn about what is true, and critically engage in a way ideally in service of being able to change some of those questions that are surfaced. And so that's why we have this slide here, just to share a graphic with folks where the title reads how the middle became the right. And in the first frame, you see someone in the center who, let's say in all earnestness, is stating both sides make some good points. Now there are some figures on the left in the blue pushing that person away. And they're then picked up in the third slide by the folks in the red, asking a very simple question of, are you all right? And that person who was once in the center, once in the middle, said, yeah, thanks. And in the last slide, you see the blue person who pushed the person in the center now asking, why are you siding with the bad guys? And I think this is just a really clever way, one of the many ways that we can express sort of this political conundrum that we're in, that there are so many people who are confused by what's happening in the world, who have a lot of legitimate questions, who are, by virtue of their own lived experiences, their social positions, might be looking at the crisis of higher education or public education, looking at the crisis of policing or housing, looking at the crisis of abortion access and reproductive health care access, from a different perspective than us. And they have real questions because they're not mired in our day-to-day activities. They're not mired quite yet in our day-to-day campaigns to address these issues on a systemic and institutional level. And so when they come to our meetings and they come to our organizations and they come to our conversations saying, well, it seems like both sides make some good points, or simply asking a question of, well, what does abortion access actually mean? Or how can we actually have free higher education for all? Our movements take those things as offense. We take it as a challenge to what we believe versus an invitation to share more about the information that someone is seeking. And so then we really sort of can't be all that upset or surprised when those we consider to be our political opponents or our opposition welcome those questions with open arms, welcome these perspectives, and really focus on developing a relationship where they can influence more people, where they can have more people advocating for their agendas, where they can have more people who, in a really fundamental way, feel seen and heard and belonging to something bigger than themselves. And if we were to take out some of the specific political points and some of the context, that is quite a universal desire. Whether you consider yourself on the left, right, in the center, sideways, upside down, diagonal, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to know that our experiences have value, and we want to belong to something larger than ourselves. And Loretta, I saw you wanted to.
No, I was just scratching my nose. I'm good.
Oh, okay, great. So here is a big part of the invitation for all of us, and it's an ongoing process. It's not something that Loretta and I sat down one day and said, all right, we're going to challenge the call out culture. We're going to start calling in, and washed our hands and walked away. It's definitely an ongoing process. And every time we engage with folks in this conversation, we always end up learning more. And that's why this is so exciting, because there are so many parts of this framework that resonates with people for different reasons. And we're excited to learn more from you in the Q&A portion about what those reasons or curiosities might be. But in terms of rethinking calling out, there are some basic principles that we want to outline that will help us towards building a calling in culture. First and foremost, when we think about the human rights movement or social justice work and positive social change work, we have to move away from an us versus them mentality, especially when we structure that around disagreements, whether those are minor or major. The point of building a movement is that we're able to build a big enough tent that brings together as many people as possible who share a general positive vision for the world. People who believe that each of us get to live in our dignity with access to the necessities that allow for our livelihood, with the sense of purpose, a right to belong, all of those things. Now, those are not easy tasks to take on, which means that people have all kinds of opinions about how we approach it, have all kinds of insights on which things we prioritize, what questions we might ask. And so we have to stop drawing these lines when really we should be excited that there are all kinds of different people who think about these questions in many different ways, who do want to move in the same general direction. We also need to spend more time as change agents, focusing and taking time to critically self-reflect on our motives and what brings us to this work. We're not here in a lot of ways to save other people. We're here because we have identified what our self-interest is in a world that is fundamentally reorganized to center the needs of humans and of the planet. And when we're able to be in touch with that, when we engage with others, we're more likely to consider, oh, perhaps they're bringing their own motives and interests to this as well. How do I seek to understand that better so that we can actually connect? We need to spend more time prioritizing strategy. We get into all kinds of heated debates with people who are our political opponents who are so far off from our own beliefs and politics, and we're convinced that we can change their mind. And if anything, they are just sucking up our time. And if anything, we are just walking into a trap where we're giving away our energy and our labor and our focus instead of building with people who may not agree with us all of the time, but can agree that there is common ground to be built and there is important work to be done. We mentioned this earlier in the calling in roadmap around this piece of envisioning outcomes. Again, it's important for us to be able to visualize and to see and to name what it is we're moving toward, so that we can also infuse some more joy and hope into this work that can often be very difficult and exhausting and make us feel terrified or bad about the world and ourselves. So it's important to name, here's actually what we're moving to so that we can organize ourselves and each other towards that. Collaboration. It's a big word. It's not easy. It's not simple to do. It requires the sharing of power, the sharing of resources, the sharing of leadership, alignment and agreement. But fundamentally, we need to move away from this competitive nature that has been built into our work, into our social change work, because it, again, only brings us down a path of wasting our time and resources trying to outdo each other and trying to prove who's better at doing some really complicated work. As we talked about earlier, we live in a culture of punishment and shame. And so we have to work on avoiding shame and ousting and punishment as ways that people change or learn. And we know, based on our relationship to education, relationships to other people, rarely do we change our behaviors or what we think about a thing when someone makes us feel bad about ourselves. If anything, we become more entrenched in our ideas, we feel less secure, we feel less safe, and less able to actually learn something new. And last but not least, we have to really value relationships. We actually have to remember that these are human beings doing this work, not robots, not machines. When we're engaging with each other online, we're not just talking to a blank screen. We're connecting with other people whose lives and inner world are just as complex as ours. And we'll be wrapping up soon on the slides presentation here. So we wanted to end on this note in terms of offering folks some very concrete examples of things that you can say to practice calling in. And these, you'll notice, mostly end with a question mark. These are all phrases we can use to keep the conversation open if that is the choice that we're making, if we want to keep the conversation open. When you said blank, I didn't understand what you meant. Do you have time for us to talk about this more now or at another time? I was wondering why the conversation became tense at this moment. Can we stop and investigate this? I've noticed that most people aren't speaking up. Can we slow down to go around the circle to get everyone's opinions? I want to revisit something that felt like disrespect to me. I'm sure you didn't mean that. May we talk some more? When you use that word, I'm not sure what you meant. Can you tell me more? Would anyone else like to share their views now? What are we missing here? Is there something we should examine more closely? So these are all questions. These are all just phrases that we can use to keep the conversation going. And one of the themes that you might notice is that these are all also opportunities to engage more people in the conversation, because oftentimes call outs end up in situations where there are opposing teams and people are piling on each other. And there may be one or two individuals who are representing two very heated, supposedly oppositional camps. And that makes it really difficult for us to have generative, functional gatherings, meetings, and conversations. So it's always helpful to pull other people in. If there are two people who have been taking too much time trying to one-up each other and call each other out for their mistakes and their misgivings, it's wonderful to be able to say, hey, actually, we haven't heard from everyone. Maybe other people have something to say about this. Maybe this is a more complicated, nuanced, robust conversation that we can have with each other. So we leave you with some of these tools, and we encourage folks to think about in their own language and their own context of the work that they do, what are some of the startup sentences that you can start practicing to keep the conversation open and keep the door open when there is conflict or harm. And of course, we want to be in touch with you. You can find us at these Twitter and Facebook handles, as well as on our websites. And I think it's time now to stop the screen share and open it up for some more dialogue and Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lone and Loretta, for that. No matter how many things I've got going on in my life, no matter how little sleep I got the night before attending one of your sessions and learning from you, I always feel rejuvenated and revitalized afterwards. So thank you so much. I'm going to get to some of the questions that we've got. There's one in the chat right now from Pam Radella, and she asks, could you expand on the university's role in free speech? This is a sensitive issue on many of our campuses.
Yeah, I think that a lot of universities get caught in the bind of not really understanding where its obligations are in protecting academic freedom and free inquiry, but at the same time, protecting the learning environment of all students, particularly vulnerable students. Well, with that as a priority, we are not necessarily going to sacrifice the safety of our student population around the protection of what they call the free speech or the First Amendment, when that is not our job. It is the government's job not to tell people what to say or what to think, but obviously we have to use a different standard. The same way we would not invite someone to teach in our physics department who doesn't believe in Newtonian gravity. I mean, just because they believe the earth is flat, we're not going to invite them to come pontificate on that, because we have an allegiance to truth, evidence, history, and facts. That's what we have to always center in the pedagogical offerings that we make to our student body. So the same way we would be violating our trust if we invited a Holocaust denier to campus around a false, two-sided, both sides thing, like, somebody who says the Holocaust didn't happen versus someone who said it did, or a slavery denier, or someone who thinks that, trans people don't have the same human rights as cis people. We don't do anyone favors by confusing our obligation to educational standards with the defense of the First Amendment. People can have the right to say whatever they want to. We have the right not to provide the cover of the university for them to say things that are not fact-based, evidence-based, or to say things that cause palpable harm to the learning environment of our students. I do want to say that there is something that we can look towards, though, and it's a concept called democratic speech in environments, DSE. And this is a concept created so that speech is promoted that supports the concepts of democracy and freedom and individualism, and all as well as group and social well-being. So that there are other ways to look at how speech is handled responsibly. And I invite people to look up DSE, democratic speech environments, as another way for a university to understand its obligation towards balancing a respect for the First Amendment, but prioritizing the learning environment of students.
And this might be a little bit of a cheeky question because I know that you're running a course on this, but maybe I'll encourage people to go sign up for your conversation that you're having soon. But I know that the next conversation you're going to be having is about the role of perfectionism and how it shows up in our organizing spaces. I'm curious if you could speak to that a little bit.
So we would love to have everyone join us on March 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern for a conversation on perfectionism. This monthly conversation series is something that we just started last month, and the first topic, I can't even remember the first topic actually, Loretta, because we covered so many things in that conversation, but it's a more casual space where folks can just come on and share their experiences. So we hope that folks will join us. Now, more specifically to your question, Talitha, on perfectionism, and particularly inside of organizing spaces, very similar to call-out culture, we ground our analysis of why call-out culture happens in the context of a white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist society that we live in. And so we track that logic that, of course, we're treating each other badly because we have very few examples of what it means to engage with each other in both a critical and kind way. We have very few examples of functional democratic processes that allow people to contribute to a public conversation where we don't necessarily play both sides, but we're able to really crystallize what are the priorities, what do we need to address. So very similarly, perfectionism, our understanding of it is that it's actually grounded, again, in white supremacy and white supremacy culture. White supremacy tells us that if Black people, if people of color, if immigrants are unable to meet the standards that have been set by these various systems and institutions, that's because Black people and people of color and immigrants have failed, have personal moral failing, or are incapable, or are lazy, versus naming, oh, actually the standards set by these systems are inhumane and impossible to achieve unless you have an incredible amount of wealth, unless you are socially positioned to meet these standards, at which point those standards wouldn't even apply to you. If you're incredibly wealthy, you can just do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Incredibly wealthy people rarely get canceled. They get their 15-minute news cycle, and then that's it, right? And we name that not to say that people should be getting canceled necessarily, but to expose what's actually the fundamental questions underneath that we need to address. That we, of course, we gravitate towards wanting to deplatform, wanting to be overly critical, wanting to be very loud in our demands about pushing people away and hiding people's ideas. But actually what we're saying is put those ideas out in the open and let progressive movements and let social justice organizations be at the forefront of demonstrating how we can truly, in a grassroots, democratic, kind, loving, joyous way, engage with these questions. Because we're on the correct side of history and we don't have to treat each other badly to make that point, right? And so then when we consider perfectionism in our organizing, we're failing to consider it actually does a lot to recognize the issues that we're attempting to take on are massive. And we need so many people to be a part of these struggles and these campaigns and these efforts and these conversations. And nobody has the answer. And if you ever meet an organization or a leader or an organizer who says, oh yeah, I have the answer, one, they're lying to you, and two, you should go the other way, right? And that's the piece that where we feel so, of course, we feel so heartbroken, we feel so worried, we feel so deeply propelled to do the best that we can to fight for the future of humanity. But if you take a second to consider all that that entails, that's a big lift. And that's going to require mistakes and mishaps and painful conversations and some difficult relationships in order to change things, because that's the nature of this work. We don't know, but we want to do the best that we can with what we have right now. Loretta, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, that was great. Thank you.
And I dropped the link to your conversation in the chat for people. Another question came in from Kelly Janisek, and Kelly says, your context for your presentation was surrounding political speech. Can this work? And I think Kelly means calling in a bullying atmosphere. What would be key?
I think calling in techniques can work in all human conversations of conflict, whether it's familial within families, whether it's within bullies. Now, certainly, some people are not trying to have a conversation. They're only dedicated to having chaos and a fight. And so obviously we would not be recommending that you use calling in technique when somebody's trying to punch you in the face kind of thing, actually trying to do harm to you. There are some people who do need to be canceled. There are some things that need to be canceled, like white supremacy and fascism and homophobia and transphobia. I mean, those things actually do need to be canceled. So, but we do recognize and appreciate the flexibility of calling in techniques because you can use them with relatives that you've had difficulty having conversations with. You can use them in school settings where people are afraid of getting called out or canceled when they don't necessarily agree with the group think idea that everybody else thinks they should think or do, those kinds of things. You can use it in work relationships. You can use it even with a lot of strangers. I find a lot of fun in challenging people just by asking them, is that how you really want to engage with me today? Kind of thing. Keep that honest inquiry. I talk about how when you're called out, you should have like these 3 things you commit to doing if someone calls you out, challenges you in a very aggressive way. Number 1, you should thank them because what they've done is given you time and attention. And those are the most precious commodities right now. When someone has noticed you, even to call you out, they've awarded you with their time and attention. So you can sincerely thank them for that. Secondly, you can appreciate and show that you've heard them by saying, that's an interesting thing or point of view. I'm going to think about that, but thank you again. And then the third thing you can do is turn the call out into a call in by saying, I really do care about you. And I'd like to know how you're feeling, what's going on with you, because I'm sure you could have gotten my attention in a less aggressive way. So I really want to know what was going on with you, that you thought that you needed to call me out this way when we could have talked, because I really do care about you. So in summary, thank them, say that you're going to think about it, and do think about it without conceding that they're right or wrong, because you haven't thought about it yet. And third, turn it into a calling in by showing that you care about them as well as you can.
I also wanted to recognize that we had participant Rabab Abdul Hadi write in to say, thank you for seeing Loretta again because she's worked with you in previous spaces before on gender and sexual justice and justice for all. So your CFA and CSU connections maybe run deep here. And then I had a question that came up. I had written it down. Oh, I wanted to know when are the times, or maybe are there ever times when calling out or canceling is the right course of action?
I can kick that off and then would love to hear your thoughts as well, Loretta. I mean, as Loretta said earlier, there are things that should be canceled. Systems of domination and control, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, and that all calls into question power. How do we understand power? What do we believe the function of power is? What's our understanding and assessment of who holds power and who doesn't, right? And that power question undergirds our approach to how we address these issues. There are campaigns that rely exclusively and solely on call out tactics. And that is wonderful because these are, for example, Amazon workers who are going up against one of the most horrendous corporations on the face of the planet. And they are sounding the alarm to say, we are delivering so many packages every single day, and there are workers who are dying on the workplace. There are workers who are making less than living wage. The same goes for the Starbucks workers who are unionizing, and they are calling out not just corporate malpractices, but also calling attention to the fact that in their efforts to organize, to change their conditions, they're meeting so many repressive tactics that workers are being fired. And these are stories that we would not hear about unless people, regular people, decided to sound the alarm and to raise the banner and say that injustice is happening here, right? And so there are many instances where it is appropriate to engage in calling out tactics. This particular framework that we've been teaching and talking with folks about is how do we make sure that we don't turn those call out tactics that we use out in the world to address these fundamental power imbalances on each other, so that we can avoid moving from punching up at political targets where it makes sense to punching down on others who may not actually know as much as we do and need to be brought in closer, or punching sideways or punching left. Folks might be familiar with that phrase, where again, it becomes about proximity and access. We share in a relative status, and yet we're taking out all of our anger and frustration on each other instead of figuring out how do we continue on this really long haul fight, right, of building a movement to change systems and institutions and culture. So there are definitely instances where if we're able to be strategic and have a clear analysis of power and who holds it, that we can use call out tactics in our organizing in a way that actually changes our conditions. But more often than not, we see ourselves getting stuck in our own circles, calling each other out for having supposedly the wrong opinion or the wrong perspective or saying the wrong things. Meanwhile, our political opponents can sit back and watch our social justice organizations crumble. They can watch our campaigns self-cannibalize. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to send any missive. They don't have to try to bribe people. They don't have to try to infiltrate meetings. We're doing it all on our own. We are doing it all on our own. And so, there's definitely a need for us to recognize when, similar to the question raised about when do we call in, there are appropriate times and inappropriate times. Loretta says it perfectly. Calling in doesn't work right when you're getting punched in the face. You want to figure out how to get out of that punch in the face, right?
But the other thing I want to clarify is that people mistakenly think that when we call for the use of calling in techniques, that we're going to give a pass to injustice that way, that we're not going to call out white supremacy if it's happening, and we're not going to call out homophobia, transphobia, ableism, anti-Semitism. We're going to call out all of those things. But the point is, a calling in is a call out, but you're doing it with love and respect as opposed to anger and blaming. But you're not giving a pass to injustice by no means. Calling in is an accountability tool that you use in order to prevent harm, to make people repair the harm that they've done, and make a plan for not doing more harm in the future. It is an accountability project. It's not a niceness lesson. A lot of people think, oh, you just want me to be nice to all these white people that get away with this, or you want me to be nice to all these transphobes. No, it's not about that at all. It is about not choosing a tactic that's more likely to thwart your goals than achieve them. Because if people think that they're going to be put on blast, if they admit that they made a mistake or need to grow, then they're not likely to want to listen to you publicly shaming and humiliating them.
Thank you. I think we have time for a very short last question because we have 4 more minutes. And I think I'm going to combine these two because they're related to me. One of them says, what do we do with our colleagues who ask us to shut up for the common good? And the other one asks, how do we move beyond the calling in when the efforts to call in have been initiated but have been unsuccessful within our own internal leadership structures? So people being silenced kind of in this way.
No,
Oh, me.
want me? I will if you want to.
How about you kick it off?
Well, first of all, we need to investigate why do people want to silence us? Because sometimes people want us to not to call attention to injustices because they're made uncomfortable. by the fact that we're calling attention to maybe their hidden privileges, or the fact that too much time, these same injustices keep happening over and over and over again, like Black at controversy. Young students will write, I'm Black at this school, and then finds out that a class that graduated 30 years ago experienced the exact same thing, and there's often a desire for people to not want attention called to situations of injustice. So we need to investigate, why do you want us to stay silent? I'm not so sure. I'm going to quote Audre Lorde, who says, silence will not protect us, but truth, honesty, kindness, I think, is something we can always use. Respect. And Maya also says, people may not remember what you said, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. So I can have any number of uncomfortable, destabilizing conversations with anybody, but I'm always going to use love and respect to do so with, because I can say the most harshest thing with the voice of love and make people feel heard and respected. And I choose that rather than using other registers.
Thanks for that, Loretta. It was a more eloquent version of what I was going to say, which was do it anyways. Even if your colleagues tell you to shut up for the common good, don't shut up. Speak out anyways, because it really is about your own assessment of your integrity, of what you're willing to put up with. And even when calling in is not working, it's not getting the outcomes that you need, do it anyways, because I think Loretta made the point earlier that sometimes we might be quick and rush into call out tactics because we think it's going to get us the outcomes that we need. And so if we do calling in and we're working through the process and we're still not seeing the change that we want to experience, sometimes we might have to extract ourselves from the situation. Sometimes we need to figure out different strategies to stay in the fight. But engaging and calling in, I think, sets a better precedent and a better road for other folks who are going to have to pick up our struggles. And that is usually the nature of all of these issues and movements that we attempt to build, is that there's not any singular person or any singular group who's able to fix it all in one given moment. So what's the legacy that we leave behind for other folks who have to continue these struggles on? What are the processes and the cultures and the conversations and the struggles that they're coming into? And how have they seen other people be able to model integrity and honesty and truth telling in a way that actually does get the goods? Because again, we know that we're on the right side of history, and our approach matters just as much.
Thank you so much. I think that's the perfect closing to the session. Asking us to keep at it even when it's hard. And thanks everyone for your great questions. Thank you, Loretta and Lone, for being here with us and helping us learn and come together. We appreciate you so much.